All right, welcome back to this podcast. It's the second episode on this paper. It's a bit long, so I split it in half. I just came back from the gym and happy to do this podcast episode. So, yes, we said that Levi's criticisms will be addressed more detail in the next section on empirical adequacy of these models. He's more critical of them. But first, let's go back to Zuckton. So when models are used to learn about human morality, Zuckton, Cartwright, and others are correct in arguing that the purpose of models is to learn something about a real-world target system. Francesco Guala argues that it is, quote, necessary to investigate empirically which factors among those that may be causally relevant for the result are likely to be instantiated in the real world but are absent from the experiment or vice versa. 2005, page 157. This procedure of establishing external validity not only applies to inductive inference from the artificial experimental world to the real world, but also to inductive inference from the artificial model world to the real world. In both cases, we want to draw inferences from highly idealized and abstract mechanisms to a causal mechanism operating in the real world. As several authors have recently pointed out, there are more important similarities than relevant differences between models and experiments, which makes it difficult to justify drawing any hard boundaries between the two. In order to gain confidence that Alexander's story provides us with the actual explanation of human morality, requires more, especially evidence from psychology and neuroscience, in order to learn about the causal mechanism behind moral behavior. Even though our models are robust, this robustness in itself only tells us something about the evolution of moral behavior in the model. That is, unless relevant similarities obtain between the real and the model world, Zuckton argues that, quote, a transition has to be made from a particular hypothesis, which has to be shown to be true in the model world, to a general hypothesis, which we can expect to be true in the real world too. Quote, end 2000, page 19. That is inductive inference. Zuckton explicates three such inductive schemata: explanation, prediction, and abduction. For the purpose of this paper, only his explanation schema is relevant. Quote here, E1 in the model world, R is caused by F. E2, F operates in the real world. E3, R occurs in the real world, and therefore there's a reason to believe E4 in the real world, R is caused by F. 2000, page 12. The phenomena R in question is the emergence and stability of moral behavior. Though Alexander explicitly wants to explain more, that is the emergence and stability of morality, we shall first consider whether these models can explain moral behavior. What we need to establish in order to make justified inductive inferences, that is extrapolation from the model world to the real world, are relevant similarities. While the relevant set of causal factors in the model, that is cultural evolution, do operate in the real world, this may be an unavoidable feature of generalized theories. When Zuckton speaks of a model's credibility, he's not talking about a literal truth, but truth likeness, a description of, quote, how the world could be, 2000, page 24. A credible, counterfactual world. For a model world to achieve this kind of credibility, it needs to cohere with the causal processes we know to be operating in the real world. The agents postulated in our model need to be, in a relevant sense, like real agents in our world. By using evolutionary game theory and bounded rationality models, Alexander intends to trump the standard rational choice theory models in virtue of credibility. Drawing inferences from his models, therefore, he argues, is at least inductively more justified than standard game theory explanations for the evolution of morality. This concession, however, is unlikely to convince many critics of rational choice theory. However, if standard rational choice models are justified, his models should be justified by extension in virtue of their enhanced credibility. If the standard models fail to achieve credibility or rather external validity, we need some further argument to see how Alexander's models are explanatory. While Alexander moves from the simple replicator dynamics to lattice models, he is continuing his quest for a more credible model world. Here we drop the unrealistic assumption of random interaction in an infinitely sized population for one-dimensional lattice in which everyone has two neighbors to interact with. Secondly, Alexander analyzes how different learning rules change the strategy dynamics in his models, all of which are rather simple but perhaps better capture the actual strategy changes in human agents. As the assumption of only interacting with two neighbors is highly unrealistic in itself, Alexander moves to small world networks where some agents have an additional interaction possibility by being connected over a bridge. Further increasing credibility, Alexander moves to bounded degree networks where every agent has a certain number of connections I between K-min and K-max. Here, connections need not be neighbors and are randomly assigned, creating networks that look fairly similar to interaction networks in the real world. However, humans obviously do not choose with whom to interact entirely at random. When we encounter someone who cheats in a cooperative endeavor, we'll try to avoid them and interact someone else next time. Alexander draws on skirms and Permantel's 2000 model of social network formation in order to model changing interaction frequencies. Without going into the specifics and intricacies of each of these models, they illustrate an important point. Alexander's book follows the modeling strategy of first ensuring robustness and internal validity, before moving on to more credible model worlds that gain complexity and inferential power. The latter approach must, of course, be closely related to empirical research into morality, most importantly, perhaps moral psychology. Robert Sugden's account of modeling is justified in virtue of being a naturalistic, pragmatic account of the actual scientific modeling practice. Models are successful in explaining, but do so by induction. Therefore, we should accept induction as a valid principle in the modeler's toolkit. Quote, however problematic that may be for professional logicians, quote end, verse 9, page 19. In a research paper on evolutionary game theory, evolutionary turn in game theory, Sugden writes, quote, longer one, evolutionary game theory is still in its infancy. A genuinely evolutionary approach to economic explanation has an enormous amount to offer. Biology really is a much better role model for economics than is physics. I just hope that economists will come to see the need to emulate the empirical research methods of biology and not just its mathematical techniques. 2001, page 128. Alexander doesn't fall into this trap, for he only sees his mathematical models as a subset of the necessary steps towards a genuine explanation for the evolution of morality. This is where empirical evidence needs to be accumulated and studies conducted, analyzing developmental psychology with respect to social norms. Alexander's work, however, guides the way for such empirical research and theory testing to commence in a field that is still nebulous and wide. How to move from robust evolutionary game theory models to the real world will be explored in the next section. So, third section here on empirical adequacy, where I said we were gonna go back to Levi. The most sophisticated criticisms of attempts to model the evolution of morality has recently been offered by Anna and Levi, 2011. Rather than denying the importance of models, Levi argues that there are two distinct modes of inquiry in which indirect modeling can be used to study otherwise complex phenomena. Levi argues that the work of Skirms, Alexander, and others is characterized by internal progress achieved within the model rather than target-oriented progress where we learn more directly about the target system itself. While Levi does not go as far as to argue that this strategy is pure conceptual exploration, he suggests that it is, quote, more conceptual in spirit, quote, and aimed at understanding the initial model itself. 2011, page 186. Target-oriented modeling, Levi argues, progresses by, quote, incrementally adding causal information, quote, end, primarily guided by considerations of empirical adequacy, page 186. In contrast, models for the evolution of morality explore the, quote, subtleties of constructed setup, quote, end, with an empirical adequacy only playing a minor role, page 186. Similarly, Sugden suggests that a, quote, model cannot produce full unless someone uses it, and whoever that person is, he or she will have to bridge the gap between model world and real world. 2009, page 26. Though Alexander downplays the role of his models by saying that they alone cannot account for much, he suggests that jointly with theories of bounded rationality and research in psychology and economics, we can get closer to the actual explanation of how morality evolved. This is the main motivation behind Sugden's credible world account of modeling. If models were only about conceptual exploration and providing theorems, any mention of the real world and the relationship of the model to it would be nothing but telling a story to sell one's model. Levi 2011 suggests that this is what might be happening in the models provided by Skirms and Alexander. However, as I shall argue, The modeling strategy of the evolution of moral norms explicitly acknowledges relevant real-world factors and successfully tries to increase the credibility of its models. In the following, I shall argue that evolutionary game theory models cannot form empirical research and vice versa. Rosenberg and Lindquist, 2005, wrote a paper on evolutionary game theory models for cooperation and how to test them empirically, which will prove highly useful for this section. They argue that we can use archaeology, anthropology, primatology, and even gene sequencing to support EGT models. Supporting Alexander, they argue that human cooperation is too sophisticated, conditionalized, and domain general for it to be a genetically hardwired trait. What Alexander does not consider is potential gene-culture coevolution. But I take him to make a deliberately weaker claim, that even if it turns out that human morality is entirely cultural, his models will be useful. If you find empirical evidence for hardwired behavior, then all the better for an evolutionary explanation of morality. However, in order to have a credible evolutionary game theory model, Rosenberg and Lindquist argue, already requires a lot of substantial assumptions. For example, emotion, reliable memories, a theory of other minds, language, imitation learning, and so forth. Experiments in economics and psychology, often done in the form of games, can inform us about how humans act and how a change in conditions changes human behavior. Such empirical work can then help the modeler to not only increase the credibility of his models, but also to eliminate those models which would tell a completely misguided story of the evolution of human morality. Rosenberg and Lindquist provide a popular example of the big game hunt hypothesis as an explanation of why humans started cooperating. They point out that empirical data suggests that Big Game Hunter was an inferior strategy in comparison to gathering, not even granting the payoffs specified in a second game. Though the Big Game Hunt hypothesis tells a nice story of why humans started to cooperate, we should treat it as even less than a just so story, because the evidence suggests that it is most likely false. As an alternative, they propose cooperative child caring, which interestingly also fits the mathematical description of a stag hunt game. In light of empirical evidence, they argue that modelers should try to alter their stag hunt models for trust by thinking about the potential payoffs of cooperative childcare, rather than the payoffs of cooperative hunting. Such is the nature of this enterprise. Both modeling and empirical research can inform each other in a variety of ways. Though many models will be discarded, this leaves us with a much narrower set of how possible explanations and gets us closer to the actual one. They close the paper by stating that it is, quote, not for philosophers to speculate how this research once commenced will eventuate. Page 156. But it is nevertheless necessary to bring in line the theoretical work done in evolutionary game theory with the empirical data from various fields. Otherwise, evolutionary game theory models are nothing but conceptual exploration, and as Sugden points out, modelers should and can aim for more. Nevertheless, Hexelman 2009 suggests caution against the hope that a, quote, huge gap between macroscopic models of moral dynamics and the known variety of microscopic processes that seems to generate certain assumed overall effects, page 5689, can be breached in the near future, if at all. Criticism directed against Alexander, stating that he failed to provide a complete explanation, is not nearly as effective when a complete explanation is not reachable anyway. While we might consider Alexander's work as only one of the first steps in getting closer to complete explanation of human reality, it remains an important step nonetheless. Though the empirical data is weak, rather because of it, it is so important to combine the research results from different fields. Models, far from being a mere add-on to this research program, appear to be a necessary and integral part of the EMP, the explaining morality paradigm, transforming it more and more into a science in its own right. Let me now, program, not paradigm. Let me now conclude the discussion with the controversial debate over whether such models have any impact on the moral status of morality. 4. Implications for the moral status of morality. Alexander concludes that, quote, evolutionary game theory, coupled with the theory of bounded rationality and recent experimental work, bridging the gap between psychology and economics, provides what appears to be a radical restructuring of the foundations of moral theory, showing that the content of moral theories are real and binding. 2007, page 291. Though their content is highly dependent on us and the structure of society. Alexander 2007
Rather than providing an evolutionary debunking argument for morality, claims to provide an objective but relative basis for morality, insofar as he shows that the principles of morality are in the best long-term interest of everyone. A claim that may seem just as radical. This distinction is important, and this is often treated anonymously. However, as I shall argue, Alexander goes one step too far when he treats the instrumental justification of morality as an epistemic justification. Due to the importance of population structure illustrated in his books, Alexander argues morality is necessarily relative to the structure of society. Morality, he argues, is objective but relative. This is an ambitious suggestion standing in stark contrast to the careful conclusions Alexander has drawn in the rest of his book, and hence deserves closer inspection. Unlike Joyce, Street, and Rosenberg, in their respective papers and books, who provide an evolutionary debunking arguments for the objectivity of morality, Alexander argues that his models, rather than undermining, are able to vindicate morality. And in doing so, he draws explicitly on Hume. Here, quote, "Much work has to be undertaken in order to unpack Hume's certain proposition that," quote here from Hume, "this is only from the selfishness and confined generosity of men, along with the sandy provision nature has made for his wants, that justice derives its origin," quote, end of Hume, but continuing Alexander here. "And as for the origin of justice, so for the rest of morality." 2007, page 291. For Humeans in the tradition of Bernard Williams, 1981, and arguably Hume himself, notions of objectivity were always somewhat odd. In fact, all of the three evolutionary debunkers mentioned above see themselves as Humeans. They argue that in light of an evolutionary explanation for the adaptiveness of moral attitudes and behavior, there is neither need nor should we endorse any magical property that makes morality somehow objective. Nevertheless, Richard Joyce, 2001, in his book The Myth of Morality, explores the possibility of vindicating the objectivity of morality by linking it to rationality, as perhaps the strongest candidate view to avoid the conclusions of an error theorist. See Mackey, 1977. Alexander's argument for the vindication of morality rests on the same motivation. If it can be shown that it is in everyone's interest to act according to morality, morality can be saved. For this approach to be successful, Joyce 2001 argues, we would need to arrive at some sort of categorical imperative that derives from rationality alone. That is precisely the route Kant took to save the status of morality from Hume's philosophy. For Humeans who see reasons as relative to desires, aims, and preferences, perhaps also beliefs, this approach must be futile. The moral heuristics will not only be relative to the structure of the society we live in, but also relative to the aims and desires we have, and hence subjective. There would be nothing more than mere heuristics that apply to the majority of the population in the majority of circumstances. Alexander does not see this as a problem. In fact, he sees it as a sufficient for grounding morality as something objective, nevertheless relative. However, as I see the previously provided arguments, sufficient for casting doubt on the project, indicating the objectivity of morality by pointing to a highly relativistic notion of rationality, crucially depending on the social structure of society. For even if we grant that this is a sort of sub-objectivity, it is not what humans refer to when talking about the objectivity of morality. Nor is it what metaethicists are usually interested in. Error theorists like Mackey, Joyce, and Rosenberg readily accept the debunking. Alexander, however, prefers a more subtle version of what we could mean by moral objectivity. His work captures something important. The advice we give our children and moral norms we teach are likely to be in the long-term best interest. They are useful heuristics that evolve to reap the benefits of cooperation and strategic interaction problems. And as Alexander points out, they're highly contingent on the social structure of society. Levi 2018 suggests that the models explored in the EMP could provide us with insights into the desirability of certain institutions and social norms, merely in virtue of their stability. For metaethics, however, the impact of the EMP may be severe, and this is where the wordplay comes in. Akin to an electromagnetic pulse, also EMP, the explaining morality program could paralyze much of the traditional work of philosophers working in morality. Hence, it comes with no surprise that many naturalists and philosophers of science seem to hold a deflated sense of moral objectivity or become errorists, such as Mackey. Much more empirical work needs to be done, but a long path to explaining morality is at least partially illuminated by the work of modelers such as Skirms, Alexander, and others. Clearly, this can only be the beginning of an explanation, but the first steps have been taken. Replicator dynamics have limits and often need to be supplanted with other models, e.g. non-evolutionary game theory models for inheritance and cognitive mechanisms, to provide satisfying explanations of real-world phenomena. A diverse set of multiple models, among which Hexelman 2009 argues, bridges can be built, may be the best thing we can hope for. But these, as I've argued, are importantly not without considerable explanatory power. It's just a faulty idea of a complete explanation that blocks such incremental steps towards a better understanding of complex phenomena such as human morality. Yeah, thanks for a bunch of people who comments on this manuscript or versions of talks I gave. Yeah, ultimately published in this very nice volume, Model-Based Reasoning in Science and Technology. I enjoyed this paper. Maybe I'll go back to this in the future. I was originally considering doing modeling work in my PhD. So what area? UC Irvine, LSE, Carnegie Mellon. That seemed like really interesting work to me, sort of a bridging between science and philosophy. But then I was led to Australia and did less modeling work. We'll see if I go back to that. I'm still very interested in the philosophy of science aspects of what we can learn from models, and I'll discuss some more papers I've written on that later. But yeah, thanks for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed this paper. You can, of course, read it. There's a link. And yeah, have a good week.